The night Earl Donovan poured the concrete, the temperature outside had dropped to 11 degrees. He had waited until 2 in the morning to be certain. Certain the parking lot was empty. Certain the last car on Route 14 had passed. Certain that the only sound left in Hartwell, Ohio, was the wind moving through the gaps in the metal roof and the low hum of the fluorescent tubes he had left burning above lanes 3 and 4. Just enough light to work by not enough to be seen from the road. He was 52 years old. His hands had stopped shaking an hour ago, which he took as a sign that the body adjusts to whatever it has decided to do, regardless of whether the mind has finished arguing. The safe was already in the ground. He had cut the concrete 3 weeks earlier, working alone on a Sunday, when the building was closed, using a circular saw with a diamond blade that screamed through the slab and filled the air with white dust that settled on everything and took 2 days to fully clear. He had dug down 14 inches with a rented jackhammer and a long-handled spade, set the safe in the hole on a bed of gravel he carried in by the bucket, back-filled the edges. Then he had mixed the new concrete in a 5-gallon bucket batch by batch, carrying it by hand from the utility sink to lane 7, pouring it carefully and tamping out the air with a length of rebar. He had smoothed the surface with a steel trowel until the seams were as close to invisible as he could make them. Then he had laid the lane boards back on top and pressed them flat with his hands and stood on them for 20 minutes while the concrete underneath cured. He had done a good job, the kind of job you do when you know it is the last one. Tonight he was finishing something different. The tin box sat on the bar counter open. He had already packed it. The cash bundles were tight and ordered bound with rubber bands he had taken from the supply closet. He had counted everything twice then, a third time because the first 2 times he had lost his place thinking about Clara. The cloth bag with the coins sat on top of the cash, the drawstring pulled snug. He had sealed the metal tube with a torch borrowed from Ray Haskins 3 weeks ago under the pretense of a plumbing repair. And he had not returned it yet because returning it would have required an explanation, and he had run out of explanations that felt honest. The letter was the last thing. He had written it 4 times. The first 3 versions were longer. He had explained the IRS case in detail, the specific statutes they had cited, the particular auditor who had come 3 times in 2 years with a briefcase, and an expression that never changed. He had explained the auditors and the lawyers and the 2 years of hearings and the way a government agency can decide you are guilty and begin collecting before anyone has proven anything in front of anyone. He had explained why he had not told her. He had explained the fear, which was not fear of losing the building or the money or even his own freedom, but the specific fear of watching her face when she understood how close they were to losing everything they had built together over 20 years. He had explained it at length because he thought explanation was the same as understanding, and had burned those 3 versions in the utility sink because he finally understood it was not. The 4th version was 2 pages. He wrote it in the careful block letters he had used since grade school, the kind of handwriting a man develops when he learns early that sloppy work reflects on the person who made it, and that the world notices these things even when it says it doesn't. He wrote what mattered. He left out what didn't. He folded the pages twice and slid them into the envelope and sealed it and wrote her name on the front. Clara. Just her name, nothing else, because her name had always been enough to say everything he meant. Then he wrote one more line beneath her name. Small letters. The kind you write when you are not sure anyone will ever read them, but you write them anyway, because not writing them feels like leaving something unfinished. And Earl Donovan had spent his entire adult life finishing things. He put the envelope in the tin box under the last bundle of cash, pressed flat against the bottom so it would not shift. He closed the lid. He held his hand on top of it for a moment in the dark of the empty bowling alley, and did not think about anything in particular, which was the closest he had come to peace in 2 years. He pulled the bar refrigerator away from the wall by himself, which took longer than it should have because his back had started giving him trouble in cold weather, and tonight was very cold. The compressor scraped against the concrete, and the sound was loud in the empty building, and he stood still for a moment after it moved, listening for headlights through the front windows, making sure the parking lot was still quiet. It was. He knelt slowly, one hand on the refrigerator for balance, and lifted the panel in the floor. He had cut it 2 years ago during a slow Tuesday in February when Clara was visiting her sister in Columbus, working carefully with a masonry blade and a grinder to smooth the edges, installing the recessed handle himself from a piece of hardware he had driven to the county seat to buy so nobody local would see it in a receipt. He set the tin box into the compartment. It fit exactly. He had measured twice before he built it, which was the only way he knew how to build anything. He replaced the panel. He pushed the refrigerator back into position. He stood very still and listened to the building around him, the particular silence of a place that holds years of other people's noise and has not yet found something else to do with it. He looked down the length of the bowling alley, 10 lanes stretching into the dark beyond the reach of the lights above 3 and 4. The varnished maple caught the fluorescent light and threw it back warm and amber and familiar. The color the floors had been, for as long as he could remember the color, they would be long after. Lane 5 was in shadow. Clara's lane. Lane 7 was in shadow, too. He had bowled on Lane 7 for 20 years. He had called it his lucky lane, not because his average was better there, though. It was by about 6 pins over the course of a season, but because Lane 7 was where he had stood on a Friday night in November of 1972 and watched Clara Marsh bowl her first strike and scream so loudly that the couple on Lane 3 knocked over their pitcher of beer, and the man had laughed so hard he had to sit down. Earl had thought in that moment that he would marry her, which was a thought he had been having for approximately 6 months and had not yet found the right way to say. He had chosen Lane 7 for the safe because of that night. Because if he was going to hide something important, it should be under the place that had given him the best moment he could remember. He thought about walking down there, standing on it one more time. He decided it was better not to. Some things are better left as the memory of the thing rather than the thing itself. He turned off the lights above lanes 3 and 4. The building went dark in a way that felt complete and absolute, the dark of a place that has been left for the night by the people who belong in it. He stood in it for a moment, in the specific silence of 20 years of Friday nights and Saturday mornings, in the particular noise this building was built to hold, and then he walked toward the front door. He got as far as the concourse. The pain came without warning, which is how it always comes. A pressure behind the sternum that moved up into the jaw and down the left arm simultaneously, a sensation less like pain than like the body announcing it is making a decision without consulting you. Earl Donovan had been a man who made decisions carefully and consulted everyone he trusted before making them. His body was not that kind of man. He sat down on the floor of the concourse between lanes 6 and 7 with his back against the scoring table pedestal. He did this not because he chose to, but because his legs decided it before he did. He put one hand flat on the maple boards beside him. The wood was cold. He could feel the grain of it through his palm. He thought about Clara. He thought about the Thanksgiving dinner they had set up in the party room every year for 25 years without interruption. 20 tables pushed together in a horseshoe so everyone could see everyone else. Anyone in Hartwell who didn't have somewhere to be. Clara moving between the tables with the coffee carafe in one hand and her good plates stacked in the crook of her other arm, because she had insisted on the good plates from the first year and had never wavered. Because people who didn't have somewhere to be on Thanksgiving deserved the good plates, full stop. And Earl had never been able to argue with her about anything she said, full stop. He thought about the boy from the Mill family on Creston Street, whose father's medical bills he had paid in 1974 from the Lane Revenue Fund, $780 for a broken arm that had required surgery because the bone had shattered against the press at work. The father had never known who paid it. The boy had grown up and gotten a partial scholarship to State University 11 years later. And Earl had covered the first semester tuition from the community fund because the scholarship had not covered everything. And the father was gone by then, and the boy was doing it alone. He had recorded both entries in the notebook the way he recorded everything, name and date and amount and purpose, because a man should know what he has given away and why, and because someday someone might need to understand what the numbers in his books actually meant. He thought about whether any of it had mattered. He looked down the dark length of Lane 7. He thought about Clara finding this someday. He hoped it would be soon. He hoped she would understand. He decided everything had mattered. The lanes and the Thanksgiving dinners, and the kids on Saturday mornings, and Clara on lane 5 with her eyes closed after a strike, which was a thing she always did. Closed her eyes and listened to the pins. His hand was still flat on the maple boards when the building went completely quiet around him, in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. The cleaning crew found him the next morning face down near lane 7, one hand still reaching toward the lane boards, as though he had been trying to get closer to something in the last moments and had not quite made it. He was 52 years old. He had built Hartwell Lanes from a gutted warehouse in 1971 with a bank loan and his father's contractor connections and 20-hour days for the first 3 years. He had run it for 20 years. He had given away more money than most people in Hartwell ever knew he had, and he had hidden the rest under the floor for a woman he loved, in a way he had never quite learned how to say with his mouth instead of his hands. The IRS came for Clara 3 months after the funeral. They did not stop because Earl did. Debt does not observe mourning. That was the winter of 1991. By the summer of 1993, the building was closed. By the following spring, Clara had sold the house, the cars, the furniture, and everything else that could be converted into a payment and still owed $40,000 when the last check cleared. 33 years passed. The morning the state of Ohio decided it was finished with Maya Calloway, the caseworker had a plastic plan on her desk and a manila folder so thin it looked like something the office had assembled in an afternoon from materials that had been waiting around for a long time. Maya had turned 18 4 days earlier. The birthday had passed the way birthdays passed in the group home, which is to say it had passed. The date on the calendar in the common room changed to the 14th, and then the next morning to the 15th, and neither number meant anything different than the one before it. There was no cake. There was no particular acknowledgement. Two of the younger girls had said happy birthday in the morning, which Maya had thanked them for, and then everyone had gone on with the day. She sat now in the molded plastic chair across from the caseworker's desk with her canvas backpack in her lap. She kept it in her lap because she had learned a long time ago that if you set your bag down in a place like this, it was harder to leave quickly when the conversation was over. And in Maya Calloway's experience, developing the ability to leave quickly and without fuss was among the most important skills a person could cultivate. She had gotten very good at it. She could be packed in 20 minutes. She could be out the door in 22. The caseworker did not look up from the folder when she spoke. She had the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this particular conversation many times and had made a working peace with what it meant. "You turned 18 on the 14th, the woman said. "The state of Ohio no longer has an obligation to provide housing or support. Your bed will be reassigned by Friday." She slid the folder across the desk. Maya opened it. She had been told that there was a file, that there had always been a file, but she had never been permitted to see it. It was thinner than she had expected, which was saying something because she had not expected much. A few sheets of paper. A lifetime apparently fit into a few sheets of paper when the lifetime in question belonged to someone the system had been moving through its processes for 15 years. A birth certificate. Mother Linda Calloway. Father listed as unknown. The mother's status in a typed note clipped to the back of the certificate, deceased 2011. Maya had known her mother was dead. She had not known the year until this moment. She sat with that for a few seconds without letting it show on her face, which was a thing she had learned to do well enough that most people could not read her at all anymore, which she had once thought was an advantage and had more recently come to understand was a more complicated thing than that. A Polaroid photograph, the edges soft from years of handling. Someone had looked at this photograph many times, which meant either the caseworkers who had processed her file over the years had looked at it, or she had looked at it herself in some earlier version of herself that she could not remember. A small girl, maybe 3 years old, sitting on a linoleum floor in a shirt that hung well past her knees. One hand wrapped around a red plastic bowling pin, the kind sold at toy stores, sized for small hands. The girl was looking at something off to the left, not at the camera, and her expression was one of complete calm. The particular calm of a very young child who does not yet understand that the situation she is in is not the way things are supposed to be and who is therefore not afraid of it. Behind her, out of focus, a row of bowling lanes stretched back into fluorescent light until they disappeared. Maya looked at the photograph for a long time. Hospital intake records from the county. A single paragraph, the language of official documentation stripped of everything that was not useful for filing. Child found at Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14, Hartwell, Ohio. Age approximately 3 years. June 2009. Mother did not return to the premises. No emergency contact on file. Child transferred to county services 11 p.m. same date. 5 foster placements listed on a single type page. No notes about why any of them had ended. They simply ended the way certain things end, without explanation or ceremony or any particular acknowledgement that something had been attempted and had not held. The first placement had lasted 8 months. The longest had lasted 2 years. The last one had ended 6 weeks before her 18th birthday, when the foster mother had needed the room for her sister's daughter. And Maya had packed her bag in 20 minutes and had walked out without looking back, because she had made a deliberate decision at some point in the past several years to stop looking back, and she had kept it. The caseworker pushed a check across the desk. "This is your remaining balance, $11.40. Maya folded the check along its existing crease and put it in the front pocket of the canvas backpack. She put the Polaroid in beside it. She looked at the address on the intake form one more time before she put it away. Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14, Hartwell, Ohio. Then she put the whole folder in the backpack because it was hers, and because there was no one else it belonged to. "Is there someone you can stay with?" the caseworker asked. "I'll figure it out." The woman looked up from the folder for the first time. Something moved behind her expression. Not pity exactly. Something closer to recognition, the particular recognition of a person who has seen a specific thing enough times to know it when it comes back around. She had seen this. She would see it again Friday. The desk, the folder, the backpack in the lap. "There are shelter listings on the back page of your resource packet," she said. Maya stood up. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it because the woman had not been unkind. And in Maya's experience, not being unkind was a more meaningful thing than people who had never needed it tended to understand. She walked out of the building into early March in central Ohio, which offered a sky the color of old concrete and a wind off the lake that had no interest in being anything other than what it was. The trees along the sidewalk were still bare. A school bus moved past with faces pressed against the windows, children watching the world from behind glass with the particular expressions of people who are going somewhere they did not choose and have learned to watch the passing things. She adjusted the backpack on her shoulders and turned left because the sun was in that direction, and warmth was the one resource she had that did not require money. The first week taught her what the group home never had. Hunger has a schedule. Cold does not. You can manage hunger with planning, with timing, with the kind of discipline that becomes second nature after enough practice. Cold is different. Cold finds the gaps in whatever you have and enters through them regardless of what you planned. She found a spot behind the public library where a heating vent pushed warm air through a grate near the ground, pressed close to the building's brick foundation, where it stayed protected from the wind. She had found it by walking the building's entire perimeter twice, with one hand trailing along the wall, until she felt heat, which was the kind of methodical problem-solving that 5 foster homes had made entirely natural. She ate at a soup kitchen on Mondays and Wednesdays. On the other days, she bought the cheapest things she could find. A loaf of white bread lasted 3 days if she tore each slice in half and ate one half at a time. A jar of peanut butter stretched to 5 days. She washed her clothes in a gas station bathroom sink at 3 in the morning and wrung them out by hand under a fluorescent light that hummed at a frequency that seemed designed for maximum unpleasantness. And a moth tapped against the fixture above her with the persistence of something that has no other options and has stopped pretending otherwise. By the end of the second week, she had $4.11. The math was not complicated. She could not afford to eat and to exist in the same week. Her phone died on a Tuesday, the battery finally failing in a way that the cheap portable charger she had found at a thrift store could no longer address. Without the phone, she lost the soup kitchen schedule and walked 14 blocks on a Wednesday morning for nothing because the kitchen had moved to a church basement across town, and she had no way of knowing this. She stood at a park fountain and drank water that tasted like the pipes it had traveled through, and then stood there for a while afterward, her hands on the rim of the fountain, looking at the gray surface of the water. She could not remember the last time someone had said her name, not as part of a case number or a room assignment or a roster check. Her actual name, Maya, in a voice that knew her well enough to say it, the way people say the names of people they know. She started walking, not toward anything in particular, just away from the last place that had told her the space she occupied was needed for something else. A trucker heading south picked her up at a rest stop off Route 33. He was hauling engineered lumber. The cab smelled like coffee and diesel exhaust, and he had a country music station playing at a volume that was committed but not aggressive. He did not ask questions. He did not explain himself or his route or why he had stopped. Maya sat in the passenger seat and watched Ohio pass through the window and thought about nothing specific, which was the best she had been able to do with her mind for several days. Small towns with dollar stores and empty storefronts where the glass had gone cloudy from years of nobody cleaning it. Gas stations with hand-lettered price signs. Churches with full parking lots beside closed businesses with empty ones. An auction house. A seed supply company with its silos visible from the highway. Everything looked like it had belonged to someone once, and the belonging had gradually loosened without anyone deciding to let go. He dropped her at a junction outside a town called Hartwell. The population sign said 3,200, and the main street's visible economy suggested that number had been arrived at during a more populated era, and no one had gotten around to updating it. She walked the main street sidewalk with the backpack over one shoulder. A barber shop with a hand-lettered closed sign that had been in the window long enough that the sun had faded the letters unevenly. An Italian restaurant with a hand-printed banner reading "permanently closed," taped across the inside of the glass and curling at the corners. A garden center with half its greenhouse panels missing and the other half doing their job with the dignity of things that keep going when the context around them has changed. A hardware store with a hand-painted sign whose edges had thickened into ridges from being repainted so many times. At the end of the block, in front of a town hall built in the federal style that Ohio river towns had favored in the middle of the previous century, there was a community bulletin board under a small wooden roof. Church rummage sale. A missing dog named Biscuit, last seen near the grain elevator, brown with one white ear. Roadwork notice for County Road 9. And one other flyer printed on standard paper, the ink slightly faded but readable. Hartwell County Tax Lien Sale. Saturday 10 a.m. Town Hall Lawn, 9 properties listed. She read through the list. Vacant lots, condemned residential structures, assessed values in the low thousands, minimum bids lower than that. Addresses she had no way of placing. The last entry read, Former Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14. Hartwell, single-story commercial structure, approximately 12,000 square feet. Decommissioned 2016. Minimum bid $6. She read it once. She read it again. Something moved in her chest that she did not have an immediate name for. Not quite recognition. Not quite the feeling of a word coming back to you after you thought you had forgotten it. Something between those two things, the sensation of a connection forming before you have the language to describe what the two things are that are connecting. She had $11. She reached into the backpack and found the intake form from her folder. She unfolded it and looked at the address printed in the hospital's administrative typeface. Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14, Hartwell, Ohio. She looked at the flyer. She looked at the intake form. She stood at the bulletin board for a moment longer. $6 would leave her with $5. $5 in a building she could not heat, could not light, could not explain to anyone, including herself. It was objectively the worst financial decision available to a person with $11. The kind of decision that, when you described it to someone later, they would nod and say they understood and mean something much more qualified than understanding. She folded the intake form back into the folder and put it in the backpack and walked away from the bulletin board. She made it half a block. She turned around. She read the flyer a third time and made the decision she had probably already made the first time she read it, the decision she had been keeping herself from acknowledging for the 60 seconds it had taken her to walk half a block and stop. Saturday was overcast. Low clouds pressed down on the hills east of town like a ceiling installed by someone who had given up on the idea of height. About 25 people had set up in folding chairs on the town hall lawn by the time Maya arrived, and the county clerk was already at the portable microphone running through the first few properties at the pace of someone who has done this many times and keeps a personal best time she is trying to beat. The vacant lots went in order. A condemned house on Elm went for $900 to a man in a fleece vest who signed the paperwork without standing up, the ease of someone spending money that cost him nothing to spend. A lot near the railroad tracks brought $400 from a woman on her phone who seemed to be bidding as a favor to someone on the other end of the call. The assembled bidders knew each other. They waved and nodded and raised their paddles with the practiced casualness of people for whom this particular Saturday morning was a routine rather than a turning point. Maya sat in the last row of chairs with the backpack in her lap. Property 9, the clerk said. Former Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14. Single-story commercial structure, approximately 12,000 square feet, 10 lanes. Decommissioned 2016. County assessment notes, roof damage, standing water. Possible environmental concerns from lane oil residue. Minimum bid is $6. Nobody moved. A man in the second row leaned over to the woman beside him and said something quietly. She shook her head. Two people glanced in the general direction of Route 14 and then looked elsewhere. The lawn was quiet in the way of people collectively deciding not to do something. "Do I have $6?" the clerk said, in the tone of someone asking a question they do not expect to require asking twice. Maya raised her hand. Every person on the lawn turned to look at her. A girl in the last row with a canvas backpack and worn sneakers, and her hand up like she was answering a question in a classroom where she was the only student paying attention. $6 from the young lady in the back. Do I hear 10? Silence. 6 going once. 6 going twice. The clerk let the silence have a full moment to itself before completing the formula. The man in the fleece vest looked at Maya with an expression she could not quite read and then looked away. A woman in the front row turned around and looked at her with something closer to concern than judgment. Sold. Nobody clapped. Maya signed the paperwork inside the clerk's office at a table in the corner while the clerk processed the remaining lot sale from the previous owner. She paid with a 5 and a 1 from the front pocket of her backpack and received a key on a plain metal ring and a deed folded into thirds. The clerk watched her fold the deed and put it in the backpack next to the Polaroid. "You know what that building needs," the clerk said with the tone of someone closing a subject rather than opening one. "No," Maya said. The clerk looked at her over reading glasses. "Neither does anyone else. That's why it went for 6. She found it 4 blocks from the main street, sitting in a cracked parking lot at the end of Route 14. The sign out front read, Hartwell Lanes in block letters, sized to be read from the road, but half the internal bulbs had blown out, and the plastic face panel had gone the yellow of old newspaper, and one side of the front glass was shattered, and had been for long enough that opportunistic weeds had grown up through the safety film on the inside. The metal roof above the main entrance had buckled and curled upward at one corner, like the edge of a page someone had started to lift and then walked away from. Weeds grew through every crack in the asphalt. The parking lot had heaved and buckled through years of freeze and thaw, and nobody with any reason to care about it. Maya stood in the middle of the lot and looked at the building. It looked like something the town had voted to stop thinking about and had mostly succeeded. She tried the key in the front door lock. It resisted. She leaned her shoulder against the door frame and turned harder, and the lock gave and the door swung inward, and the smell came out first the way smell always arrives before anything else in a closed space. Mildew. Standing water somewhere deeper in the building. And underneath both of those, something older and more chemical. The heavy mineral smell of lane oil that has soaked into wood over decades of use and does not fully leave even when the use stops. It had been sitting in the grain of the maple for 20 years before the building closed, and had been sitting there since. The front counter ran the full width of the entrance. Behind it, a wall of shoe cubbies, each numbered 200 slots in numbered rows, holding nothing now but the memory of what they had held. A cash register on the counter with its drawer standing open and empty. The ceiling overhead had gone to ruined tiles, sagged and buckled in long rows, some already collapsed onto the floor and dried into gray shapes that looked like something between geology and neglect. Scoring monitors hung from brackets above each pair of lanes, their screens dark and cracked along the edges where the plastic had contracted over years of temperature change. 10 lanes of maple and pine stretched from the concourse into the dark at the far end of the building. Plastic chairs lined the concourse in rows facing the lanes, still arranged with the precision of the last person who had set them up, coated now in dust, so thick and uniform it looked like someone had draped gray fabric over each one. The varnish on the lane surfaces had peeled back in long curls, hardened and cracked where they had landed. The wood beneath water-stained and buckled in the pattern of moisture that comes from above and works its way across a surface slowly over seasons. Maya walked the concourse, slowly looking up at the walls rather than the floor. Brick on three sides, the good dense brick of a building meant to last. Cinder block on the fourth. The steel beams overhead showed surface rust, but the kind of rust that comes from time and humidity rather than from any compromise in the structure itself, the rust of neglect rather than failure. She had learned what she knew about buildings during 3 years in her second foster placement, working weekends alongside a man who ran a small handyman business and had no patience for wasted labor, including hers, which meant he had taught her to do things correctly the first time. He had not been a kind person in the ways that mattered most, but he had been thorough, and what he had taught her about structures had stayed with her in a way that other things from that period had not. She could tell the difference between a building that was dying and one that had simply been left alone too long. This one had been left alone. She walked lanes 1 through 6, crouching at the gutters where the water damage was worst to check the condition of the subfloor. The wood was buckled and water-stained, but the damage was even across the surface, the pattern of a roof leak spreading gradually across a flat expanse, not the pattern of structural failure. Lane 8 through 10 showed the same. Warped boards, water-darkened wood damage concentrated near the gutter edges where standing water had nowhere to go. Lane 7 was different. The maple flooring had split apart in the center, not buckled outward the way water damage buckles wood, bowing the surface in a gradual curve. This was different. The boards had been pushed upward from below, cracked and displaced in a pattern that radiated from the center of the lane, the specific geometry of something beneath the floor expanding or shifting against the underside of the boards. Through the gap where the wood had split and lifted, the concrete slab below was visible. Maya crouched and looked at the concrete through the gap. It was not the same concrete as the rest of the floor. The slab throughout the building was old concrete, gray and aggregate rough, and poured in an era when bowling alleys were built with the understanding that they needed to support decades of heavy machinery and foot traffic and would not be replaced. But the concrete visible through the gap at Lane 7 was different, smoother with the more uniform surface texture of a different era's pour. A section roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, its edges not blending naturally into the surrounding original slab, but meeting it at angles that had been feathered to minimize visibility. The color was slightly lighter, the surface slightly more even. Someone had cut into this floor, had poured new concrete over something, had laid the lane boards back on top and expected them to stay. Maya knelt beside the gap and pressed her palm flat against the newer concrete. It was cold, colder than the slab around it by a noticeable margin in a room where everything had been at the same ambient temperature for years, as though whatever was underneath held its own cold, a separate temperature from the rest of the building. She knocked with her knuckle against the center of the patch. Dense, solid, the flat sound of thick concrete with solid material behind it. She moved her knuckle to the left edge of the patch and knocked again. The sound changed. A dull resonance, slightly hollow, the muted thud of metal underneath a thin layer of concrete closer to the surface than the center was. Maya sat back on her heels and looked at the broken wood around her. She looked at the gap in the floor. She looked at the concrete that was newer than it should have been, smoother than everything around it, colder than the ambient temperature of the slab for reasons she could not yet explain. Somebody had put something under this floor deliberately and had expected it to stay there. She stood up. She looked down the length of Lane 7 toward the pin deck machinery sitting frozen and rusted in the shadows at the far end of the building. Wind moved through the broken front window and found its way down the lanes and hummed against the cracked faces of the overhead monitors. She had $5. She had a canvas backpack and a key on a metal ring, and the kind of patience that comes from learning early that wanting things immediately is a form of optimism that people in certain situations cannot afford. She would figure out the tools in the morning. That evening, she cleared a section of the concourse near the front counter. She found a push broom in the utility closet, the bristles stiff with dried debris but functional, and worked steadily for 2 hours sweeping broken ceiling tiles and broken glass into piles and moving them by cardboard box toward the front door. She found the floor drain near Lane 2 clogged with accumulated debris and cleared it with her fingers and a length of wire stripped from a cracked monitor bracket. And once the blockage came free, the standing water at the base of the concourse began draining on its own with the sound of something that has been waiting a long time to move. By the time the light through the shattered front window had gone from gray to dark, she had a clear path from the front door to the back wall and clean concrete in a section between lanes 3 and 4 where the overhead beam still held a full row of undamaged ceiling panels. She unrolled her sleeping bag on the cleanest stretch of floor. She ate the last granola bar from the front pocket of her backpack, eating it in 4 deliberate bites and folding the wrapper precisely before she put it in her pocket, rather than on the clean floor she had just spent 2 hours making clean. 10 bowling lanes stretched into the dark ahead of her. No traffic noise, no voices from adjacent rooms, no one's schedule or rules or requirements, no one counting days until a number changed and the room belonged to someone else. It was the first ceiling she had had in 3 weeks. She did not need it to be more than that. Not yet. She reached into the backpack and found the Polaroid. She held it by the edges, the way she always held it, not touching the image surface, the way you hold the only copy of something. The little girl on the linoleum floor, the red plastic bowling pin, the out-of-focus lanes behind her stretching back into light. She had looked at this photograph so many times over 15 years that she had stopped actually seeing it the way you stop seeing the face of a clock you have looked at all your life. She knew its contents without looking. She could have described every element from memory: the shirt too big for the child's frame, the collar drooping off one shoulder, the way the child's fingers were wrapped around the pin, both hands a secure grip, the expression on the girl's face, which Maya had always read as the calm of a child too young to understand what was happening. She was about to put it away when she stopped. She turned it over. She had turned it over before. Many times over many years. The back of the Polaroid was blank white with the standard border stripe at the bottom. She had checked it years ago and had been so certain of this that she had stopped checking. The certainty of a thing you checked once and filed away. She looked at the back of the photograph in the dark. She could not see anything. She reached for her phone and then stopped because her phone had been dead for 10 days and was not coming back to life. She put the photograph back in the backpack and lay down on the sleeping bag and looked up at the steel beams in the underside of the metal roof and listened to the building settle around her. Somewhere at the far end of the building near the pin decks, a loose sheet metal panel tapped against its frame in a rhythm set by the wind outside, slow and intermittent, the sound of something that has been doing this for a long time without an audience. In the morning, she told herself. But she did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark between lanes 3 and 4 in a building she had bought for $6 in a town she had never heard of before this week, and she thought about the address on the intake form in her folder. Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14, Hartwell, Ohio. She thought about the address on the last entry of the tax lien sale flyer. Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14. She thought about the fact that she had read both of these on the same day and had stood at the bulletin board and had felt something move in her chest before she had consciously connected the two addresses which meant that some part of her had connected them before the rest of her was ready to. She thought about the concrete at Lane 7, the newer pour, the temperature difference, the sound her knuckle had made when she moved it from the center to the edge. She thought about what kind of person pours concrete over something in the middle of the night in a building they own in the floor of a specific lane and then boards the floor back up and goes home. The answer she kept arriving at was a person who is afraid, a person who has decided that hiding something is the same as protecting it, and who has enough fear driving that decision that they cannot see the ways those two things are not the same at all. She understood that kind of thinking more than she wanted to say. The loose panel tapped. The wind moved through the broken glass and down the length of the lanes and came to rest in the dark, where the machine sat still and full of a mechanism that had once known exactly what to do. Sleep came eventually the way it does when the body decides that the mind has had enough time with its thoughts. In the morning, in the thin pale light that came through the east-facing windows before the sun had cleared the ridge outside of town, Maya picked up the Polaroid and turned it over. She looked at the back of the photograph in the morning light, really looked without the assumption she had been carrying for years that there was nothing to see. In the bottom right corner of the white border, written in pencil, so faint it had nearly disappeared into the surface of the photographic paper pressed into the material, rather than sitting on top of it, were 5 words in a set of letters that she read 3 times before she stood up. Lane 7. Found here. HL6/2009. She sat on the floor of the concourse between lanes 3 and 4, with the photograph in both hands and her sleeping bag still partly unrolled beside her, and the morning light coming in at a low angle through the east windows, and she read the notation 3 more times. She looked at the intake form in her folder. Hartwell Lanes Bowling Center, Route 14, Hartwell, Ohio. Child found at this address. June 2009. She looked at the gap in the floor at Lane 7 visible from here, the broken wood and the exposed concrete below it, newer and smoother and hollow sounding when you knocked on its edge. HL. She had been brought up in the system with the understanding as specific as anything else she knew about herself that she had been found at a bowling alley in Ohio at approximately 3 years old. She had carried the address for 15 years in a folder and had never been back to it because going back to a place where you were abandoned at age 3 is not something a person in the foster care system has the resources or the reason to do. And then the address had appeared on a bulletin board in a town she had arrived in by accident, and she had raised her hand at an auction without fully understanding why. And she had paid $6, and she was sitting on the floor of the building with its address in her file and a notation on the back of a photograph she had owned for 15 years that said exactly where in the building she had been found. She set the photograph down on the sleeping bag. She looked at Lane 7 across the concourse, the broken floor, the exposed concrete, the gap that showed what was underneath. She looked at the little girl in the photograph, the calm expression, already waiting for whatever came next. Maya stood up. She folded the sleeping bag with the precision she brought to everything that needed to be done correctly and once. She put the Polaroid back in the backpack. She shouldered the backpack and looked down the length of the building. There was something under Lane 7. She was going to find out what it was, and she was going to need a sledgehammer. Caldwell's Hardware sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign so frequently repainted that the letters had developed raised edges you could feel if you traced them with your finger. The door had a bell on a spring that announced arrivals with the specificity of a different era of retail. A radio somewhere in the back of the store played country music at conversational volume, the kind of station that rotates the same catalog of songs in a slightly different order every few hours and has listeners who would notice if it changed. Maya went through this door at 8 in the morning. The shelves ran floor to ceiling in rows that made complete organizational sense to whoever had built them and required some orientation from anyone new. Tools and fasteners and hardware sorted by a system that rewarded patience. The smell was mineral and dry machine oil, and cut wood, and something that might have been WD-40 or might just have been the accumulated smell of 40 years of problem solving. A man stood behind the register at the back. Late 60s, built broadly across the shoulders and chest, with hands that had done sustained physical work for long enough that the shape of the work had become structural. Reading glasses perched on his forehead. He was marking prices on a receipt with a stub pencil when Maya came in, and he looked up with the unhurried attention of a man who has had the same doorbell for 30 years and knows it means a customer rather than anything more urgent. "I need a sledgehammer," Maya said, "and a cold chisel." He came around the counter without speaking and led her down the center aisle to the tool section. He pulled a 12-pound sledge from the rack and held it toward her. She took it, turned it in her hands, tested the balance, checked how the head sat on the handle. She had learned to do this from the man in her second placement who had believed that a tool held wrong was eventually a tool that hurt you, which was one of the more useful things she had taken from that period. She checked the price tag on the handle. $35. "I have 5, she said. She said it the way you state a material fact when the material fact is the whole of what there is to say. The man looked at her. He looked through the front window toward Route 14, where the upper portion of the Hartwell Lane sign was visible above the roofline of the building between the hardware store and Route 14. He was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than slow. "Take the sledge," he said, "and the chisel. Bring them back when you're done." She looked at him. "I'll pay you," he said. "I know." He held out his hand across the aisle. "Ray Haskins." She shook it. "Maya Calloway." He went back to the register. He stopped at a small refrigerator beside the register, the kind that holds drinks and lunch, and pulled out a paper bag and set it on the counter beside the tools without making anything of it, the gesture of someone who does something so often that the explaining of it would feel like more work than the doing. "My wife makes extra," he said. That was all he said about it. Maya picked up the bag along with the sledgehammer and the chisel. She did not thank him because he had specifically indicated he did not require thanks, and because she understood that some gifts are made in a way that gratitude would change rather than complete. She carried the tools across the street and into the building and put the paper bag on the front counter without opening it yet. Because there was something under Lane 7, and she wanted to understand what it was before she ate anything else. She put on the work gloves she had found in the utility closet the previous evening. Canvas gloves stiffened with old paint from whatever the last work in this building had been. She stood over the gap in the Lane 7 floor and raised the sledgehammer. The remaining maple boards came up in pieces. She swung in short, controlled arcs, the technique of sustained heavy work, rather than the technique of getting it done quickly and paying for it in an hour. The wood split and splintered, and decades of lane oil trapped in the grain rose up in a mineral chemical smell that spread through the still air of the building and did not move because there was nothing to move it. The concrete patch was fully exposed now. She switched to the cold chisel. She held it at a low angle against the edge of the patch and hit it with the flat face of the sledge. Concrete chipped at the edge. She worked her way around the perimeter of the patch, striking every few inches, clearing the feathered edge. The perimeter was thinner than the center, as she had expected. The person who had poured this had taken care at the edges to blend it in. Better care than an untrained person would manage. This had been done by someone who knew how concrete behaved. After 20 minutes, a piece the size of her fist broke free from the edge. Underneath it, gray-painted steel, lightly corroded, solid. She kept working. An hour of steady strikes, chipping and clearing, brushing debris away with her gloved hands, the sound of the chisel against concrete, and then against steel, ringing through the empty building, each time the chisel found the edge of the buried thing. Sweat moved down her back. Her palms blistered inside the stiff gloves. Concrete dust settled on her face and arms and in her hair. By the time the safe was fully exposed, she had been in the kind of sustained physical discomfort that stops registering as discomfort and becomes simply the condition of the work. Roughly 2 feet wide, a 1.5 feet deep and tall. Steel painted gray, the paint blistered and flaking from years of humidity working through the concrete above it. A single keyhole in the faceplate. No dial. The design of an older era of safe, the era of cash-heavy small businesses that did not trust the banking system to stay open when they needed it. She tried the key from the tax lien sale, too wide for the keyhole. She set it aside. She sat on the edge of lane 6 and looked at the safe sitting in its cradle of broken concrete. Her arms ached from the shoulder to the elbow with the specific ache of sustained striking work. She looked at the steel box and thought about the care it had taken to get it here. The cutting of the original slab, the placing of the safe, the gravel bedding, the concrete pour batch by hand in the dark, the troweling of the surface, the replacement of the lane boards and the 20 minutes of standing on them in the cold and the quiet. Someone had done all of that with the intention that it would hold for a very long time. It had held for 33 years. She stood up and walked back across the street. Ray was pricing screws in the back of the hardware store when she came through the door. He turned and looked at her face. Concrete dust in her hair and on her forearms and at the corners of her eyes. The blistered palm of her right hand visible at the edge of the glove. "I need bolt cutters," she said. "There's a safe under lane 7. Ray set the box of screws on the shelf. He was still for a moment in the same particular way he had been still when she had first mentioned the building that morning. A stillness that was not the stillness of surprise, but of something expected, arriving a stillness of reckoning. He pulled a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters from the wall hook near the door. He picked up his jacket from the stool behind the register. "I'll come with you," he said. They crossed the street together without discussing it. Ray ducked through the front door and walked the concourse to lane 7 without pausing to look around the walk of someone who knows where he is going inside a building he has been in before. He stood at the edge of the broken floor and looked down at the safe sitting in its concrete cradle and did not speak for long enough that Maya understood the silence had content. "Earl always said lane 7 was his lucky lane," Ray said. His voice had the quality of a man reporting something he has been holding for a while and has now found the right moment to set down. "I thought he meant his bowling average." He knelt beside the safe and positioned the bolt cutters around the shackle. The lock was old steel corroded from years of humidity working down through the concrete above it, and the first cut bit in without breaking through. The second went deeper. On the third, the shackle snapped, and the two pieces fell to the concrete floor with a sharp report that went to the far wall and came back as echo. Ray stepped back. Maya reached down and pulled the door open. 2 items inside. The first was a canvas bag, dark green heavy, in a way that shifted when she lifted it, the weight of something packed densely, but not rigidly. She set it on the concourse floor and untied the drawstring. Rolls of currency, hundreds and fifties bound with rubber bands that had gone brittle over the decades and cracked or broke entirely when she touched them. Some had already broken, the bills inside fanned apart. She could see the series dates printed in the corners of the bills. 1974, 1981, 1986. Money that had last been handled by the person who put it here. The second item was a metal tube roughly 14 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, the ends welded shut. No markings. Heavier than its size suggested. Whatever was inside did not shift when she tilted it in different directions, which meant it was either packed completely solid or was a single dense object. She carried the canvas bag to the front counter and spread the rolls across the surface. Ray stood beside her and watched without touching anything, his hands in his jacket pockets. Maya sorted the rolls by denomination, and Ray kept count on the back of a scorecard he found in a cardboard box behind the counter, using the columns that had been printed for bowling scores. It took 40 minutes, $83,000. She looked at the number Ray had written at the bottom of the scorecard column. She looked at the money spread across the front counter of a building she had bought for $6. She had had $5 that morning. The distance between $5 and $83,000 was not something she had a ready framework for, and she noticed that her hands were steady, which she thought about for a moment without coming to a conclusion about what it meant. Ray looked at the canvas bag, then at the welded tube, then at the number on the scorecard. When he spoke, it was in the tone of someone saying something they have been deciding whether to say. "Earl always thought he was protecting Clara," he said. "He was looking at the money, not at Maya. I never knew he'd gone this far." She looked at him. He was not finished. He was the most private man I ever knew, Ray said. Did more for this town than anyone understood because he did not believe in people knowing what you had done for them. Said the help was the point, not the credit. He paused. The IRS didn't see it that way. They saw cash-heavy books and a man who wouldn't explain himself in the language they understood, and they decided that meant guilt. Maya waited. He closed his alley in '93, Ray said, after he was gone. Clara couldn't keep it open with frozen accounts and a tax bill that didn't stop growing just because Earl had. He exhaled slowly. I should have done more back then. I knew what he was dealing with, and I let him deal with it alone because he wanted it that way. And because Earl was the kind of man who made you feel that helping him was somehow taking something from him. He looked at the welded tube sitting on the counter. What's in that? He said. I don't know yet. I need a torch to open it. Ray picked the tube up and turned it in his hands. He set it back down. Give me 20 minutes, he said. He went back to the hardware store and returned with a welding torch in a canvas bag and a pair of heavy leather gloves and the particular efficiency of a man who knows exactly where everything in his store is located and has never needed to look. He set up on the front counter, lit the torch with a sound like a small inhalation, and worked the blue flame slowly along the welded seam at one end of the tube. The metal went orange, then white at the weld line. Sparks dropped onto the counter surface and died without catching anything. The smell of hot steel joined the older smells of the building. 8 minutes. The weld softened and Ray twisted the cap free with the leather gloves, the metal groaning as the seal broke. He tilted the tube and a small cloth bag slid out onto the counter. Maya worked the drawstring loose. Gold coins. 30 of them, each roughly the size of a silver dollar, but heavier by a significant margin. The dense, heavy weight of metal that has been sealed in the dark for a long time and has the gravity of things that have been waiting. They spread across the counter in a loose pile with the flat amber color of old gold, without shine or sparkle the way gold looks when it has forgotten light. Ray picked one up and moved to the east-facing window where the morning light came in. He turned it slowly. On one face, a man's profile in bas relief. On the other, an antelope in full stride. Krugerrands, he said. South African gold bullion. My father had a few of these from the 70s. He looked at the coin for a moment more. 1 troy ounce each, 22-karat gold. He set it back on the counter. At spot price right now, somewhere between 23 and 2,500 each. Condition affects it. Maya looked at the 30 coins on the counter. She did the arithmetic. 70,000, she said. Give or take. Ray nodded. Plus the 83 in the bag. He looked at the scorecard. $153,000 hidden under a bowling lane in a building that sold for 6. Maya said, is it mine legally? Ray was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coins, then at the cash, then at her. That depends on who it belongs to, he said, and whether that person is still alive. He set his hands flat on the counter. The wife is still alive. Clara Donovan. She's at the assisted care facility over in Ridgemont, about 20 minutes east. Maya picked up one of the coins. It was cold and dense in her palm, heavier than an object of that size had any right to be. She turned it once and set it back with the others. I need to talk to her, Maya said. Ray reached into his jacket pocket and set his truck keys on the counter beside the scorecard. 1998 Ford, he said. Cracked dashboard and the radio only gets one station, but the engine is sound. He paused. I'll watch the building while you're gone. She looked at the keys. He said Earl would have wanted her to know. Maya took the keys. The road east out of Hartwell ran through flat farmland, interrupted by small crossroads with no traffic signals. The fields were bare in the early spring, the soil dark from recent moisture, the sky the same flat gray it had been all morning. She drove Ray's truck with the window cracked an inch, and the radio playing the one station it could receive a man singing in a straightforward way about something he had lost and understood. He was not going to get back, which felt like the right music for the drive without being something she would have chosen. The Ridgemont Care and Rehabilitation Center was a low brick building at the edge of town with a circular drive and a flagpole with a flag that hung without moving in the still morning. Inside the hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and something floral underneath it. Lavender, or an approximation of lavender, the kind of scent chosen to suggest comfort rather than to actually provide it. Handrails ran along both walls. Doors stood open on either side of the corridor, some showing empty beds with tucked corners, some showing the backs of heads turned toward televisions. A woman at the front desk asked who she was visiting. Clara Donovan, room 22, down the hall, last door on the left. She walked the corridor and knocked on the open door frame of room 22. A woman sat in a chair beside the window, small and thin white hair cut close to the head, hands resting on the armrests of the chair with a slight tremor of advanced age visible in the fingers. But when she turned her head toward the knock, her eyes were sharp and clear behind wire-rimmed glasses, the eyes of someone who has seen a great deal and whose vision has not been softened by it. She took Maya in with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste the first few seconds of looking at a person. The backpack, the concrete dust still in Maya's hair at the temples, the red knuckles in the blistered palm. "My name is Maya Calloway," Maya said. "I bought the bowling alley on Route 14 at the tax lien sale last week." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Her expression did not shift in any particular direction. Then she said, "Sit down." Maya sat in the wooden chair across the small space from her. The room was small and specific, the specificity of a space that has been lived in long enough to absorb the person inside it. A nightstand with a clock and a glass of water. A dresser with 3 framed photographs arranged with deliberate care. A television mounted to the wall dark. "I found something under lane 7, Maya said. She did not say the amount. She had decided on the drive over that the amount was not the first thing. Clara was still. The tremor in her hand stopped. She looked at Maya with an attention that felt complete and old. The attention of a woman who has been waiting for a specific piece of information for a very long time, and is now determining whether this is the moment of its arrival. Then she looked out the window at the parking lot below. A car was pulling in. She watched it park and watched the driver get out and walk toward the building's entrance. And then she looked back at Maya, and her eyes were different than they had been a moment ago. Not softer exactly, but more open. "Earl knew they were coming for him," she said. Her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who has had long enough with a set of facts to report them without the reporting costing her anything extra. "He spent the last year of his life moving money." She paused. "I told him to stop. I told him to pay what they wanted and be done with it, and to trust that we would rebuild whatever we needed to rebuild. He said it wasn't about the money. He said it was about not letting them take everything we'd built." She folded her hands in her lap. The tremor was gone from them. "He watched 3 of his friends go through it before him," she said. "Men who ran businesses just like his. The IRS froze their accounts before there was even a formal hearing. Innocent or not made no practical difference. By the time the courts had sorted through it, the money was gone, and the houses were gone, and the savings were gone, and the marriages in 2 cases were gone as well. Earl swore that would not happen to us." She looked at the photographs on the dresser. Maya could see them clearly now. A young couple standing in front of a bowling alley on what appeared to be an opening day, the sign behind them bright and new. A woman in a graduation cap and gown smiling. A man in a white dress shirt holding an infant at what appeared to be a family gathering. "He said if anything happened to him, Lane 7 would take care of me," Clara said. She paused. "I thought he meant bowling." Maya did not speak. "After he died, I went through that building. Every closet, every cabinet, every room. The office, the storage room, the mechanical pit. I spent 3 full days in there after the funeral while the lawyers were still arguing about the estate." She shook her head slightly. "I never thought to look under the lanes. I didn't know you could pour new concrete into an existing slab without someone noticing." She stopped. She looked at her hands. "Earl, could she said. He noticed everything and never drew attention to any of it. That was the whole of him," she said. "The noticing and the silence about the noticing. The IRS had come 3 months after the funeral. $120,000 in penalties, back taxes, and compounding interest. She sold the house in Hartwell, sold both cars, sold the furniture in stages as she needed to. Still owed $40,000 when the last payment cleared. Moved in with her daughter Karen in Ridgemont. Karen had passed in 2012, had been at this facility since. The room was quiet. The clock on the nightstand ticked. I spent 30 years wondering what Earl put under that floor, Clara said. She looked at Maya with a directness that had not softened at any point in the conversation. Now a girl I've never met is sitting in my room telling me she found it. She paused. How much? 153,000, Maya said. Cash and gold coin. Clara closed her eyes. She kept them closed long enough that Maya heard the clock tick 4 times. Outside the window, the car that had parked earlier was gone. When she opened her eyes, she looked not at Maya, but at the photograph on the dresser. The young couple in front of the bowling alley. 2 people standing in front of something they had built and did not yet know they were going to lose, and smiling the smile of people who do not yet know this. That money was supposed to protect me, Claire said. She said it in the measured tone of someone stating a thing they have said to themselves many times, so many times, that the saying of it has worn down to something almost neutral. It sat there in the dark while I lost everything above it. Maya sat with that. She did not try to answer it or soften it or reframe it into something more manageable. Some things are accurately described by exactly what they are, and the attempt to improve them is a form of inattention. She drove back to Hartwell on the same road she had come in on. The farmland, the crossroads, the flat sky that had not changed since morning. She parked Ray's truck in the bowling alley lot and went inside and stood at the front counter for a while without moving. Then she started clearing the bar area. The bar occupied the space behind the lanes, separated from the concourse by a half wall and a row of high-top tables bolted to the floor. The bar counter itself was solid oak, darkened by decades of use, and marked with the rings of glasses and the burns of cigarettes balanced on its edge, the physical record of years of Friday nights. Behind the counter, a commercial refrigerator sat against the back wall with its compressor dead and its door hanging slightly open. She dragged the refrigerator away from the wall. It was substantially heavier than it looked, and the compressor base scraped across the concrete with a sound that traveled through the empty building and returned differently than it had left. She stopped and then kept going, pushing until the refrigerator was a full 2 feet clear of the wall. Behind it, where no light had reached in decades, cobwebs and mouse droppings, and the smell of old rubber from the compressor's deteriorating seals, and a section of wall that had been in complete darkness for 30 years. She pushed the bar counter. It did not move. She reset her feet and put her full weight behind it, and it moved 6 inches with a low scraping groan against the concrete floor. Under the counter where the refrigerator and the cabinet base had hidden it for 30 years, the concrete floor had a square cut into it. A panel roughly 18 inches on each side, flush with the surrounding slab. A recessed handle rusted into its notch along one edge, just large enough to hook 2 fingers into. Maya crouched. She hooked her fingers into the handle and pulled. The panel lifted on the 3rd attempt, the seal of decades breaking with a sound like an intake of breath. Below it, a shallow compartment lined with concrete on all sides, roughly 12 inches deep. And inside the compartment, a tin box. Old, the kind that had once held Christmas cookies or holiday popcorn, printed with a decorative design that age and darkness had reduced to a faint suggestion of color. The lid was rusted shut. She carried the box to the front counter and worked the lid open with the cold chisel. Cash. More cash. Bundles of it packed tightly, the rubber bands crumbling when she touched them, some already broken, and the bills fanned inside the bundles. Hundreds, 50s, 20s. Series dates running from the late 70s through the early 80s. She counted it the same way she had counted the first. Sorted by denomination, stacked, tallied on the back of the same scorecard Ray had used. $197,000. She sat on the stool behind the front counter and looked at the 3 numbers on the scorecard. 197 from the bar, 83 from the safe, 70,000 in gold, $350,000 give or take, hidden in two locations inside a building that had sold for $6 at a county tax sale with 25 people present and no other bidders. She sat with that number for a while, not because it produced in her what she might have expected it to produce, not elation or relief or the particular satisfaction of a problem solved, but because it had been Earl Donovan's, and Earl Donovan had put it here for a reason, and the reason was a woman in room 22 in Ridgemont who had sold her house and her car and her furniture and had still come up $40,000 short, and who had been living 20 minutes from this floor for 30 years without knowing what was under it. She reached into the tin box for the last bundle of cash, and her fingers touched something else. An envelope. White paper yellowed at the edges and the corners sealed. She picked it up by the edges and turned it over. On the front, in small, careful handwriting in blue ink, a name and a line beneath it. Clara. When you find this, I'm sorry it took so long. Maya held the envelope in both hands and looked at it. She turned it over. The seal was fully intact, the paper aged but not deteriorated. 33 years in a tin box in a concrete compartment under a bar counter in an empty building, and the letter inside was still there, still sealed, still waiting. She set it on the counter beside the money and looked at it. She picked it up. She set it back down. This isn't mine, she said. She said it aloud to the empty building because saying it aloud made it a decision rather than a thought. She left the money on the counter and put the envelope in her jacket pocket and walked out to Ray's truck. The drive to Ridgemont the second time felt shorter. The road was the same, but her understanding of where it was taking her had changed. Clara was still in the chair by the window when Maya knocked on the doorframe of room 22. The afternoon light had shifted and now came through the window at a lower angle, catching the photographs on the dresser differently than it had that morning, lighting the young couple's faces from the side so that the bowling alley sign behind them was almost readable. Clara saw the envelope before Maya reached the chair. Her eyes went to it and stayed there. Her hands lifted from the armrest and then stopped. Maya held it out. I found something else, she said. Under the bar. There was another compartment. This was with the money. Clara looked at the handwriting on the front. She took the envelope from Maya's hands slowly with both hands, with the care you use when handling something you thought was gone. She held it and looked at his handwriting and ran her thumb across the ink. She turned the envelope over, turned it back. She held it against her chest and closed her eyes. Then she opened it. She unfolded 2 pages handwritten front and back in the same careful blue ink as the name on the front. She read in silence. Her lips pressed together once briefly. Her jaw tightened at something on the second page. She read slowly, and when she reached the end of the second page, she went back to the first and read it again from the beginning with the same deliberate pace. When she finished, she set the pages on her lap and looked at Maya. Can I read it to you? She said. Maya nodded. Clara picked up the pages and held them level. She had stopped trembling entirely. Dear Clara, she read. Her voice was even and steady, the voice of someone who has decided to read a thing properly and means to follow through. I don't know when you'll find this. I hope it's soon. I hope it's not too late for it to matter. She paused, continued. I hid the money because I was afraid. Not of the IRS. I was afraid of watching you lose the house, the car, the life we built together. I thought if I put enough somewhere they couldn't reach it, you'd be safe no matter what happened to me. I thought that was the same as protecting you. She stopped. She looked at the page for a moment. Continued. I was wrong. I should have told you. I should have trusted you to face it with me the way you faced everything else in our life together. Instead, I made the decision alone, and I left you alone with a debt and a building full of secrets I never explained. That isn't protection. That's cowardice wearing the clothes of love, and you deserve better from me than that. Clara's voice did not break. It carried the words steadily the way a structure carries weight without advertisement. I chose lane 7 because that's where you bowled your first strike. November 16th, 1972. You screamed so loud the couple on lane 3 spilled their beer. I thought if I'm going to put something important somewhere, it should be under the place where you were the happiest I ever saw you. She stopped. She looked out the window. A delivery van was moving slowly through the parking lot below. She watched it, and then she looked back at the page. There is a notebook in the tin box under the bar. Every person I helped with money from the lane revenue is in that notebook. Names, dates, amounts. I kept records because I believe a man should know what he has given away and why. I want you to have it. Don't let anyone tell you those were unreported earnings. They were gifts. The IRS doesn't have a category for that, but I do. Clara, the money isn't the gift. The bowling alley is. Every Friday night we spent there. Every birthday party in the back room. Every child who walked through the door on a Saturday morning and learned to bowl for free because I believed a building that belongs to a town should do something for the town. That was the life we built. I am sorry I couldn't protect it better. I am sorry I couldn't protect you. If someone finds this letter and brings it to you, I hope they are good. I hope you tell them thank you for me. I never stopped thinking about you, not even under the floor. Earl. Clara folded the pages along their creases and set them on the nightstand beside the clock. She sat without speaking. The room was very quiet. The afternoon light had moved further along the wall and now lay across the floor in a long bar between the two chairs. He always was better at writing than talking, Clara said. Maya did not speak. She sat in the wooden chair and let the moment be what it was without trying to shape it or fill it. Two women in a small room with a dead man's letter between them, and outside the window, the ordinary afternoon continuing without any awareness of what was happening inside. Clara put her hand flat on the nightstand. Her fingers were completely still. Thank you for bringing this to me, she said. She looked at Maya directly. He asked whoever found it to be thanked. So I'm saying it. Maya drove back to Hartwell as the afternoon light went from flat gray to something warmer and lower at the edges. She parked the truck in the lot and went inside and stood at the front counter with the money spread across it and thought about what came next. She thought about it for a long time. She had almost missed the notebook entirely. It was at the bottom of the tin box under the last layer of bills, a small leather-bound ledger whose cover had darkened with age and whose corners had softened from handling. She had been so focused on the letter and the money that she had not looked for anything else and had only found it when she went back to the box to double-check the count. She opened it. Earl Donovan's handwriting, the same blue ink as the letter, but smaller and more compressed, the handwriting of a man filling a ledger rather than writing to his wife. Entries in columns across the page. Date, name, amount, purpose. She turned pages slowly. The entries went back to 1971, the year the alley opened. Small amounts mostly in the early years. A medical bill, a month's rent for a family whose primary earner had been laid off. Groceries for a woman with 4 children and a husband who had left. Entry after entry in the same careful hand, the record of a man who believed that the revenue his building generated belonged partly to the community that had made the building possible, and who kept careful account of what he gave because he believed accountability to yourself was more important than accountability to anyone else. She reached a page near the middle of the notebook. October 1985. She read the entry carefully. Grant Whitfield, Hartwell State University, first semester tuition, $4,200. Community fund. She read it again. Then she set the notebook flat on the counter and looked at the name. Grant Whitfield. The man who had come to her parking lot 3 days after the tax sale with a business card and a measured expression and an offer of $8,000. Then $15,000. His attorney's language about federal liens and title defects and the county's prior agreement to sell. His expression when she had turned both offers down, the expression of a man recalibrating, trying to identify which variable was not behaving as expected. She turned back further in the notebook. To 1974, 3 pages in, March 1974. Edward Whitfield, mill accident, medical expenses, $800, lane revenue fund. She set the notebook down. The man who had stood in her parking lot with an attorney and a development plan. The man who had spent 2 weeks trying to find legal grounds to take this building away from her. His father had been in a mill accident in 1974, and Earl Donovan had paid the medical bills from the lane revenue. He had attended his first semester of college in 1985 on money from Earl Donovan's community fund. And he had built the career and the capital that now funded his development company on an education that Earl had helped make possible and had never known any of it. Maya closed the notebook. She put it on the counter beside the canvas bag in the welded tube in the tin box. She looked at everything arranged there in the low afternoon light. $350,000. A letter that had waited 33 years. A notebook full of names. And somewhere in Hartwell, a man who thought he understood the value of this building and had not yet understood anything about it. She heard a truck outside before she heard him. Not an SUV. A pickup older the engine sound of a vehicle that has been maintained rather than replaced. She heard it pull into the lot and stop. She did not go out to meet him. She waited. Grant Whitfield's footsteps came across the parking lot and stopped at the open front door. He stood in the entrance with the posture of a man who is accustomed to being the largest presence in a room, but something in it was different from the first time. He was wearing work clothes, not a suit. His hands were in his jacket pockets. The attorney was not with him. He looked at the front counter, at the money in the notebook and the empty canvas bag and the welded tube beside it. He looked at Maya behind the counter. "I filed a petition with the county," he said. "My attorney believes there may be an unresolved federal lien from the original IRS case. If it predates the tax sale, the deed could be voided." Maya looked at him. She reached under the counter for the folder she had prepared that afternoon, the IRS case closure documentation she had found in the county clerk's digital archive, a service she had accessed from the library's public computers 2 blocks away. "The IRS closed the case against Earl Donovan in 1998, she said. She set the folder on the counter and opened it. Clara Donovan paid $120,000 in penalties, and the lien was released and recorded with the county clerk. She turned the relevant pages toward him. "There is no outstanding federal claim on this property. The tax lien sale was valid. The deed is clean." Grant looked at the documents. He did not reach for them. Maya picked up the notebook. She turned to the October 1985 entry and set it on the counter open facing him. Earl Donovan kept a record of every person he helped with money from the lane revenue, she said. She kept her voice level. Not aggressive, not soft, just even the voice of someone stating the terms of a situation. She tapped the page. Grant looked down at the open page. She watched him read it. She watched his eyes go to his own name, to the dollar amount, to the date. He did not move. She turned back to 1974, found the entry for his father, set it in front of him. He read it. The building was very quiet. Wind moved through the broken section of front glass and hummed against the cracked scoring monitors. "My father's name," Grant said. He said it the way you say a thing when saying it is the only way to verify that what you are seeing is what you are seeing. "Earl didn't tell people what he did for them," Maya said. That was the point. Grant looked at the entries for a long time. His father's name and then his own. The dates, the amounts, the spare, purposeful language of a man keeping honest accounts. His attorney could handle the petition withdrawal, he said. He said it quietly, addressed to no one in the room, the way a man speaks when he is informing himself of a decision rather than announcing it. He stepped back from the counter. He looked at the building, the length of the concourse and the lanes beyond it, and the darkness at the back where the machinery sat. The broken window, the stacked ceiling tiles near the door, Lane 7 with its torn wood and its empty concrete cradle. He looked at it for a long moment with the expression of a man looking at something he has been refusing to see clearly for a long time and is now at some cost seeing clearly. He walked back out to his truck. Maya watched the taillights until they were gone. She looked back at the notebook open on the counter. October 1985. Grant Whitfield. First semester, $4,200. She closed the notebook and set it beside the tin box. She did not know if he would come back. She thought about what it meant to spend 35 years constructing a version of yourself on a foundation you did not know someone else had laid. She thought it probably took more than one afternoon to reckon with that honestly. She would give him the time. She reached behind the counter and found the push broom. She started sweeping. There was a great deal left to do. The petition withdrawal came through on a Thursday morning. Maya learned about it from the county clerk's office when she called about permit timelines for the electrical reconnection. The clerk mentioned it the way administrative staff mentioned resolve matters briefly and without weight as a fact that had settled itself. The petition filed by Grant Whitfield's attorney had been withdrawn. The deed stood. There were no outstanding claims on the property. Maya thanked her and hung up and went back to work. She had been working every day since she had spread the money across the front counter and looked at it in the evening light and understood what it was and what it was not. It was not luck. It was not a windfall. It was the accumulated consequence of a man who had been afraid and had made decisions alone that he should have made with his wife. And the bill for those decisions had come due 33 years ago and had been paid by a woman who was now 84 years old and living in a room with a clock and 3 photographs in a window that looked out at a parking lot 20 minutes east. The legal argument for keeping the money existed. She had examined it carefully with the rigor she brought to anything she needed to be honest with herself about. Property embedded in real estate transfers with the property. She owned the building. The safe and the bar compartment and everything in them had been embedded in the building when she bought it. The argument was there, and it was not without merit. But Earl had not hidden that money for whoever happened to buy the building at a county tax sale. He had hidden it for Clara. He had labeled it with her name and sealed it and buried it, and written underneath her name the thing he most needed her to understand, that it was for her, that it had always been for her, that he was sorry it had taken so long to arrive. The 33 years and the girl Clara had never met were circumstances, not changes of intention. The money belonged to Clara. The decision was not difficult. Maya drove to Ridgemont the morning after the petition was withdrawn. Clara was sitting up in the chair by the window with her hair combed and her good cardigan buttoned to the top, which Maya understood as a form of preparation, the way a person straightens themselves when they know something is coming and they intend to receive it properly. She told Clara the full amount, the breakdown between the safe and the bar compartment and the gold. She told her about the account she had opened at the bank in Ridgemont the previous afternoon in Clara's name, with $120,000 deposited. Clara looked at her. That is enough to cover any remaining obligations from the original tax settlement with interest adjustment, Maya said, and enough to cover your care at this facility for several years beyond the current cost projection. The money has been nothing but trouble, Clara said. I don't want it. It isn't trouble anymore, Maya said. Earl settled the trouble. You paid the trouble. What's left is what he always meant it to be. Clara looked at the photographs on the dresser. The young couple, Karen in her graduation cap, Earl in his white shirt holding someone else's child at a gathering, the kind of photograph that gets framed because it catches something true about the person in it. The rest of the money, Maya said, is in a separate account for the building. Repairs, equipment, permits, reconnection fees. Earl's name stays on the deed as founder. I'm putting the building back the way it was meant to be. Clara turned from the photographs and looked at Maya with the directness she had brought to every conversation. Both things, she said. You're saying both things can happen at the same time? Yes. Clara sat with that. The clock ticked. The morning light through the window had gone from gray to a pale, thin yellow that was almost warmth without fully arriving at it. Then use whatever the building needs, Clara said. Earl loved that place more than anything except me. And sometimes more than me, though, I never told him I noticed. She paused. He would have wanted it to be what it was. She looked down at her hands and then she nodded once. Small and certain, the nod of a woman who has decided something and considers the deciding to be the conclusion of the matter. Neither of them said anything else about the money. Grant Whitfield came back on a Saturday morning. Not the black SUV, a pickup truck, old or a working truck, rather than a statement of arrival, the bed loaded with 2x4s and sheets of plywood and a stack of oak planks that Maya recognized as lane surfacing material before she had finished crossing the parking lot to meet him. He backed up to the front door and got out and started unloading without looking for acknowledgement or offering explanation. He lifted a sheet of plywood from the stack and carried it through the front door and set it against the interior wall and went back for the next piece. Maya came and took one end of the next sheet, and they carried it in together without speaking. It took 20 minutes to empty the truck bed. When it was done, Grant stood in the parking lot and looked at the building with the expression of a man looking at something he has decided to see accurately. My father bowled here every Wednesday night for 15 years, he said. He was looking at the sign at the letters that had lost half their internal bulbs and whose plastic face panel had gone the color of old newspaper. He died when I was 17. Heart attack at the plant. I left this town the day after the funeral and didn't come back for a long time. He paused. I thought if I built something new on this block, I wouldn't have to see what was here before, he said. He said it without self-pity, flatly the way a man states a fact about himself once he has been forced to recognize it as a fact rather than a justification. I've done it in 3 other places. It usually works. Usually, Maya said. He looked at her then. The look of a person who has had the thing they were trying to say completed by someone else in the way they meant it. He got back in his truck and drove away. He came back the following Saturday with drywall and joint compound and a case of primer. The Saturday after that, with paint and colors Maya had already chosen. He never stayed for the midday meal that Donna Pierce from the diner brought over. He never explained himself or referred to the petition or to the notebook entries or to the names of his father and himself written in Earl Donovan's careful blue ink. He came on Saturdays, unloaded what he had brought, worked until early afternoon, and left. Ray Haskins watched him from the hardware store doorway one morning, coffee in hand, arms folded. He watched Grant carry a section of oak planking through the front door of the bowling alley and come back out for the next piece. He said Earl used to say good wood needs time to straighten out. He said it to Maya without inflection, a man applying a thing he remembered to a situation that warranted it. Then he finished his coffee and went back inside to open the store. The work proceeded with the momentum of things that had been decided. Ray came by every morning before the store opened. He brought tools and coffee and a patience for instruction that expressed itself through precision rather than encouragement. He showed her how to frame a wall and plumb it without a second person to hold the other end, how to run electrical conduit through a ceiling joist, how to tape and finish drywall seams so they disappeared under paint. Your hands learn faster than your head, he told her one morning, checking a stud she had just set on the layout line. She had heard a version of this from the man in her second placement, but it had meant something different coming from him. From Ray, it was an observation about competence rather than a comment on deficiency. She adjusted the stud until the bubble in the level centered. He nodded and moved to the next mark on the plate. Carl Metzger appeared on a Saturday in the middle of the second month. He was a retired electrician in his mid-70s, a man who had wired commercial and residential buildings in Hartwell County for 4 decades and whose arms still had the shape of that work, even if he moved with more care than he once had. He showed up at 8 in the morning with a canvas tool bag and an aluminum ladder and no introduction or explanation, and he spent 6 hours running new wire from the main breaker panel to the lane lighting brackets overhead, working methodically and without conversation, stopping only to check his work at each junction before moving to the next. When he was done, he packed his tools and carried his ladder out to his truck and stood in the parking lot for a moment looking at the front of the building. He said Earl gave my daughter her first real birthday party in the back room when she was 7. He bought streamers and had a cake made at the bakery. We couldn't have managed that year. He knew without being told. He picked up his ladder. He shook his head when Maya said thank you and drove away. A plumber named Dennis Schultz came the following week and replaced the corroded supply lines in the kitchen and the bathroom without being asked and declined to discuss payment. A woman named Patricia Oakes, who ran the garden center on the east side of town, arrived one morning with 2 flats of marigolds and a trowel and spent the better part of a day on her knees along the front edge of the parking lot, working the compacted earth until it was loose enough to hold roots, then planting the marigolds in two careful rows and watering them from a can she refilled at the bathroom sink. Maya watched her from the doorway. "He sponsored my son's first year on the high school bowling team," Patricia said without looking up from her work. "Bought the team shirts, paid the travel fees for away meets." She pressed soil around the base of the last plant. "I didn't know until 3 years after he died. Someone showed me the ledger entry." She stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. "Marigolds are supposed to keep pests away," she said, "though I think anything that was going to get into this building already has." She took her trowel and her empty flats and drove away in her garden center truck. Each of them, at some point during the day, they walked to lane 7 and stopped for a minute or two. They looked at the floor where Maya had poured fresh concrete and set a small square of tempered glass flush with the new surface, a window into the slab just large enough to see the space below where the safe had sat for 33 years. The empty cradle of broken concrete visible through the glass, lit from the side by whatever light the east windows provided at that hour. Nobody said anything about it. They stood, and then they went back to work. The pin deck machinery required more research than anything else in the building. 10 lanes required 10 functioning pin setting machines. Earl had installed Brunswick A2 units in 1971, the standard of their era, heavy iron frames with mechanical arms and steel sweep bars built to last for decades of daily use. The units in the building were frozen and corroded beyond practical restoration. But the A2 had been installed in bowling alleys across the country over 3 decades, and a community of mechanics still maintained and rebuilt them. Parts were specialized but not scarce. Working units still existed. Ray found a dealer in Indiana with 6 rebuilt units in a warehouse outside Indianapolis. Another in Kentucky with 4 more in comparable condition. Maya bought all 10. Ray drove the truck to Indiana on a Tuesday, the bed loaded with moving blankets. He made the Kentucky run on Thursday. Maya and Grant unloaded them while Ray directed, and they spent 2 days following an installation manual that Ray had obtained through the Indiana dealer, bolting the machines into the mechanical pit behind each lane, threading the drive belts, calibrating the pin table drop, checking the sweep bar travel against the printed specifications. On the second evening, Ray powered up the first machine. The motor engaged with a sound like something waking up. The sweep bar came forward on its track, cleared the pit, and returned. The pin table descended, completed its cycle, and lifted. The machine ran through the sequence with the heavy, competent sound of old iron performing the function it was built for. Ray stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched it run 3 cycles without speaking. "I used to watch Earl run these empty every time he got one back from service," he said. "He'd run it for 10 minutes just to hear it. He said a machine you could hear was a machine you understood." Maya said nothing. She listened to the machine and thought about a man who had stood in this pit and listened to the same sound and had believed at some point that the things he was building would last. They would last, just not in the form he had expected. The apartment took 3 weeks to build. Maya framed it in the space behind the mechanical room in the rear cinder block partition of the building. One main room with 2 windows, a bathroom, a kitchenette with a window. She cut through the east wall herself with a reciprocating saw, borrowed from Ray, positioned so that it looked out across the parking lot toward where Patricia's marigolds were coming up in their rows of orange and yellow. She did most of the framing herself. Ray checked every wall for plumb before she closed it with drywall. The plumber ran the water supply and drain lines. Grant tiled the bathroom floor on a Saturday, without being asked, working steadily and quietly for 4 hours, until the floor was done, the grout line straight and even, the work of someone who had learned to do things correctly and had not unlearned it. When the apartment was finished, Maya drove to Ridgemont. She brought Clara back on a Wednesday afternoon, driving the county road slowly, the truck's dashboard cracked, and the radio playing the one station it could find. Clara sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out the window at the farmland and said very little. She seemed to be doing something internal that did not require conversation. They parked in the Hartwell Lanes lot. It no longer looked the way it had when Maya had first stood in it. The shattered front glass had been replaced. The marigolds along the front edge were fully up and in color. The parking lot cracks had been filled and sealed. The sign still had its dead bulbs because Maya had decided to do the sign last after everything that mattered was working. But the plastic face was clean and the letters were readable from the road. Clara got out of the truck slowly, one hand on the doorframe, and stood in the parking lot and looked at the building. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she walked to the front door and Maya held it open. The lanes were finished. New maple surface on 7 through 10, the damaged boards replaced, and the whole surface refinished and sealed. Lanes 1 through 6 refinished over the original wood, the water damage sanded back to sound surface, and the varnish reapplied in 3 coats. The overhead monitors cleaned and reconnected sitting dark above each pair of lanes, waiting for someone to start a game. The scoring tables cleaned and polished. The plastic chairs replaced with wooden ones from a school auction in the next county, solid and simple and right for the space. Clara walked the concourse slowly. She looked at each lane in turn. She stopped at lane 5 and stood there for a moment. "This was his lane," she said. "Yes," Maya said. "Ray told me." Clara looked down the length of the lane toward the pin deck. The machine behind lane 5 was rebuilt and ready, sitting in the pit with its mechanism still. She walked to lane 7 and stood at the end of it and looked at the glass set flush in the floor, the window into the empty space below. She looked at it for a long time. She did not say anything about it. Then she said, "Show me the apartment." The apartment was small and purposeful size for a person rather than for impression. The main room had 2 windows and a wood floor that Maya had sanded and sealed herself over 2 evenings on her hands and knees with a rented machine. The kitchenette had a counter, a sink, a 2-burner range, and a refrigerator that worked and was the right size. The bathroom had a tub with a grip rail that Ray had insisted on and had installed himself with the care he brought to anything structural. Clara stood in the doorway of the main room. She looked at the window that faced the parking lot and the marigolds in their rows. She walked to it and stood looking out. She put her hand flat against the wall beside the window. The drywall was smooth under her palm. "Earl would have liked this," she said. She was quiet for a moment. "He always said the back of the building was wasted space. He would have done something with it 30 years ago if he hadn't been so focused on the lanes." She turned from the window and looked at Maya. "Is that a yes?" Maya said. Clara looked around the room once more. The window, the marigolds beyond it, the kitchenette with its small range, the door to the bathroom. "I'll bring my things Friday," she said. She moved in on a Friday morning with 2 cardboard boxes and a canvas bag. Maya helped carry them from the truck. Clara had brought the 3 photographs from her dresser at Ridgemont, and she arranged them on the windowsill in the kitchenette where the morning light would reach them. Earl and Clara in front of the bowling alley on opening day. Karen in her graduation cap. Earl in his white shirt with the infant at the gathering, whose name and occasion Clara had never explained, and Maya had never asked about. Within the first week, Clara had curtains on the windows. Within the second, she had a small bookshelf and a pot of rosemary on the kitchenette counter, and a system for the marigolds early morning before the sun was high on her knees with a broad-brimmed hat and the watering can she had asked Maya to source from Haskins Hardware. Ray Haskins saw her out there the first morning. He was at the hardware store doorway with his coffee, the door open, watching her work along the row of plants. He did not say anything. He went back inside. But Maya noticed that after that morning, he kept the store's front door open on the days Clara worked in the parking lot, and that he found reasons to be near the front of the store during those hours. The opening was on a Saturday in late May. Donna Pierce had organized more of it than Maya had asked her to, which was nothing, because Maya had not asked her at all, which meant Donna had organized everything. She arrived at 7 in the morning with a cooler of lemonade and set it up on the refinished front counter. Ray arrived at the same time with a portable grill in his truck bed that he set up in the parking lot. And by 9, he had hot dogs and burgers going with the quiet efficiency of a man who has worked this particular event enough times to have made a system of it. Patricia Oakes brought an additional flat of marigolds and filled in the gaps along the front edge where the first planting had been thin. Grant arrived at 8:30 with his truck and helped Ray arrange the folding chairs in the parking lot without discussion, setting them in rows the way you arrange seating when something is going to be said and people will want to face the front. About 40 people came. Maya had not sent invitations. The information had moved through Hartwell the way information moves through small towns, through Donna's counter and Ray's morning regulars, and the bulletin board outside the town hall, through the particular network that towns maintain through long habit, and the understanding that some things need to be known by everyone. People came because something in them responded to the information the way people respond when they understand that something they had stopped expecting has come back. They walked the concourse and touched the scoring tables and sat in the wooden chairs facing the lanes with the particular ease of muscle memory, the ease of people sitting in a position they have sat in before and discovering that the body has not forgotten it. Children ran the concourse in socked feet and slid on the new lane surfaces with the complete commitment of people for whom rules about sliding on freshly varnished maple are someone else's concern. A brass plaque had been mounted beside the front entrance that morning, done at a fabrication shop in the next county. Hartwell Lanes, established 1971 by Earl Donovan, reopened 2024 by Maya Calloway. Every lane tells a story. This one never stopped. Below the main text, 2 lines in smaller type. The Saturday morning free bowling program for children 9 to noon. Any child who walked through the door. The same hours Earl had kept for 25 years. Clara asked to speak. She came to the front with her cane and one hand on the brick wall beside the plaque. She stood without shifting her weight or adjusting her position, the stillness of someone who has said something clearly in their mind before they have said it aloud. Most of you knew Earl, she said. The parking lot was quiet in the way of people who understand that the person speaking has earned their attention. Some of you bowled here every Friday night. Some of you had birthday parties in the back room. Some of your children learned to keep score on those monitors up there. She paused. Earl built this place for this town. He made mistakes. He was afraid at the end, and he made decisions alone that he should have made with me. And those decisions left me with a debt I spent 7 years paying and 30 years wondering about. She said it without anger, the way a woman states the true shape of a thing when she has had long enough to see it from all its sides. He was not a perfect man. He was a good one. And I have spent 40 years trying to explain to myself what the difference between those two things actually means. She looked at Maya. A girl none of us knew found what Earl left behind and drove 20 minutes to give it to an old woman she'd never met, and then came back here and spent 3 months putting this building back together with her own hands. Her name is Maya Calloway. Earl always said Lane 7 was his lucky lane. Looking at what that lane has given us, I think he was right in ways he didn't know to expect. She looked at Maya for another moment. I think he would say she bowled a perfect game. The applause was not large or loud. It was the kind of applause that happens when people are moved rather than impressed, the sound of recognition rather than celebration, the sound of a group of people acknowledging something that was in front of them the whole time, and that they are only now seeing clearly. The afternoon went the way these afternoons go when they are going well. Ray tended the grill. Donna moved through the building with the lemonade pitcher. Clara sat at lane 5 for 2 hours and talked with everyone who came and sat beside her with the focused attention of a woman who has been in a room by herself for a long time and intends to correct the deficit. Grant sat on the front steps for most of the afternoon, not quite inside, not leaving. The particular position of a man who is present without fully committing to it, yet which Maya understood as the closest he was going to come to it for now, and accepted as enough. Late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned to a few small groups near the bar, in the parking lot, Maya walked to the breaker panel in the utility closet and turned off the overhead fluorescence. The building went dim. Then the lane lights came up. Warm amber strips set flush into the floor on both sides of each lane, glowing upward through the maple and pine. The scoring monitors above each pair of lanes lit up a soft blue. The neon trim along the bar counter that Carl had rewired pulsed a low, steady red. The building looked different this way. Not a project, not a restoration, not a statement about what a town could do when it decided to pay attention. Just a bowling alley in the late afternoon light lit from within, the way it had been lit every Friday night for 20 years, when the lanes were full and the pin setters were running, and the particular noise this building was built to hold filled it from the front door to the back wall. Clara came out of her apartment at the back and stood at the edge of the concourse. She looked at the lanes in the amber light, the color moving through the new wood and the old walls alike. She did not say anything. She just stood there and looked at it. After everyone had gone and the folding chairs were stacked and the parking lot was empty, Maya turned off all the lights except the lane lights. She left them on because the building looked right with them on. She climbed the steel ladder, bolted to the back wall, and pushed open the roof hatch. The roof was flat gravel and tar paper, still warm from the day's sun. She walked to the front edge and sat with her feet hanging over the parking lot below the main street of Hartwell. Beyond it in the early dark, the diner's windows yellow, a car passing slowly. The hardware store dark now and locked. The sky had gone from orange to a deep blue along the western ridge, the last color of the day holding just above the tree line before the dark completed itself. She reached into the backpack and took out the Polaroid. She had carried it for 15 years. The edges were soft from handling. She looked at the girl in the photograph with the knowledge she had now, which was different from the knowledge she had brought to every other time she had looked at it. The calm expression she had always read as the calm of a child, too young to understand. She understood now that the calm might have been something else. The calm of a child who was in a familiar place. The calm of a child who was, in whatever way a 3-year-old understands such things, home. She set the Polaroid on the gravel beside her. She heard the roof hatch open behind her. She did not turn. She heard the careful steps of someone who moved with attention to where their weight was landing, the steps of a woman with a cane on a gravel surface in the near dark. Clara came and sat beside her. It took a moment, and Maya put out a hand, and Clara took it and lowered herself to sitting on the low parapet at the roof's front edge. She set her cane across her knees. She looked out at the street. They sat without speaking for a while. Then Clara said, "I have to tell you something." Maya looked at her. Clara was looking at the street, the diner, the hardware store dark, the houses beyond with their lit windows. "I wasn't dishonest with you," Clara said. "I just didn't tell you everything." She adjusted the cane across her knees. "When Earl died in 91 and the alley closed in 93, I stayed away from this building for a long time. Years, it hurt to see it. But eventually I started coming back. Not inside, just standing in the parking lot, sometimes remembering what it had been. In 2005, when the new owner opened it, I went in a few times. Bowled once on lane 5. It wasn't the same, but the building was the same, the bones of it. When that owner closed in 2016, I started coming back to the parking lot again." She paused. In June of 2009, the building was closed. There was a gap between owners about 9 months where no one was running it. I still had a key from the years after Earl died. I used to let myself in sometimes just to walk through the building alone. She stopped. One afternoon I went in and there was a child in the building. Maya was very still. "A little girl," Clara said, "maybe 3 years old, sitting on the floor near lane 7. She was wearing a shirt that was too big for her. She had the red plastic pin from the display rack behind the front counter in her hands, one of the promotional pins Earl had put up in the mid-70s. She was completely calm, the way small children sometimes are when they have been alone long enough that they've stopped expecting anyone to come and have made a kind of peace with the room they're in." Clara looked down at the Polaroid on the gravel between them. "I looked for an adult. There was no one. I checked every room, called out, went to the parking lot and up and down the street. Nobody." She put her hand on the parapet beside Maya's. Her fingers were still. "I went back inside and sat down near the child. I didn't want to stand over her. She had dark eyes, very steady, very calm. She watched me without any distress. We sat together for a while. I talked to her about Earl. I told her about the building, about the lanes, about lane 7 in particular. 'His lane,' I said. 'His lucky lane.' She just looked at me and held the pin with both hands. She paused. I took a photograph because I didn't know what else to do. I had a Polaroid camera in my bag because I had been going through Earl's photographs that week sorting them. I had brought the camera along. I didn't know why at the time. She looked at the Polaroid. Then I called county services. It took them 40 minutes to come. The woman who arrived was kind. She picked the child up and the child went with her without crying. She was still holding the pin when the woman picked her up and the woman let her keep it for a moment. And then there was the moment when she had to take it back and put it on the counter, and I thought that was going to be the moment the child cried. But she didn't. She just opened her hands and looked at where the pin had been. Clara looked at Maya. I wrote on the back of the photograph before they left. The lane number. The date. HL for Hartwell Lanes, because I thought if the photograph ended up in a file somewhere, someone who read it should know where the child had been found and what those initials stood for. Maya picked up the Polaroid. She looked at the faint pencil notation in the corner. Lane 7. Found here. HL6/2009. She had read those letters for 15 years as someone's initials. She had never thought to read them as the initials of a place because the place had not yet been a place she knew. She looked at the girl in the photograph with the pin in both hands and the lanes going back into the light behind her. The woman from county services told me the child would enter the system, Clara said, that these things usually resolve within a few weeks, family located or placement found. She paused. Nobody was located. Maya held the photograph. I thought about her, Clara said. Not every day, but often. Every time I drove past this building on Route 14, every time I thought about Earl and Lane 7. She looked at Maya. When you knocked on my door in room 22, I didn't know. You were 18. I had no reason to connect the two things. You were a girl who had found something and had driven 20 minutes to give it to a stranger. She stopped. She looked at the photograph and then at Maya. It was my own journal that made me think of it. After your second visit that evening, I went back through my journal. I have kept a journal for 50 years. I looked up the entry for that afternoon in June 2009. I had written everything. What the child looked like. The shirt, the pin, the way she sat. The date. June 14th. And then I had written something I hadn't let myself think about again until that evening. She was quiet for a moment. I wrote she was calm the way Earl was calm, as though she already knew the building and was simply waiting for it to remember her. She looked at Maya steadily. You were born on June 14th. Your intake record lists June 2009 as the date you were found. You would have been 3 years old. The lane lights below made the front windows glow amber against the dark. The marigolds along the parking lot edge were closed for the night, folded against themselves, but in the morning they would open again, and Patricia would come with her watering can. Maya looked at the photograph in her hands. She looked at the girl who had been sitting near Lane 7 on a June afternoon in 2009, calm and waiting in the building where Earl Donovan had hidden everything he had been afraid to lose. She had bought the building for $6. She had been drawn to a flyer by an address she had read in a folder the same morning, an address she had carried for 15 years without knowing what it meant to go there. She had come back to the place where she had been found without knowing she was coming back to it, in the way that certain things find their way to where they belong without anyone making a plan for it. I don't know with certainty, Claire said. I can't know with certainty. But I know what I saw that afternoon. I know the date I wrote in my journal and on the back of that photograph. And I know that when you walked into my room at Ridgemont, you were carrying a photograph that started in a file opened at this address in June of 2009. She put her hand over Maya's hand. Her fingers were warm. Earl always said Lane 7 was his lucky lane, she said. I think he meant it more ways than one. The street below was quiet, the diner dark, Ray's store dark, the houses showing their yellow windows in the deep blue evening. Maya set the photograph on the parapet between herself and Clara. She sat with what Clara had told her, not trying to resolve it into something simpler than it was, not trying to name it with a word that would make it feel finished. Some things are not finished. Some things are the beginning of a longer thing that has not yet found its shape. She had been found in this building. She had come back to it. She had bought it for $6 because the address on a flyer matched the address in a folder she had been given the same morning, and because something in her had connected those two things before she had the language for the connection. And beneath her now, through the amber windows, Lane 7 was visible in the lane lights. The new concrete, the glass set flush in the surface over the empty cradle below, the window into the place where something had been hidden for 33 years in the hope that the right person would eventually find it. Earl always believed that places hold things, Clara said, not just objects, people, histories. He used to say that a building that has been full of people for long enough never fully empties. The people leave, but the weight of them stays in the walls. She looked out at the street. I used to think that was the kind of thing a man says when he loves his building more than he can explain, she said. I'm not sure I think that anymore. Below them, through the amber windows, the lane lights held steady. The machines in the pits behind each lane sat still and ready. The building was quiet in the way it had been quiet on the night Earl Donovan had finished his work and stood in the dark and looked down the length of the lanes for the last time. The quiet of a place that holds its breath between the people who fill it. Maya picked up the Polaroid. She looked at the girl in the photograph one more time. The calm expression, the hands around the pin, the lanes going back into the light. Then she set the photograph back down on the parapet. She left it there. She did not put it away. She left it on the front edge of the roof of the building, where she had started in the town where Earl Donovan had built something that had outlasted his fear of losing it in the evening dark of a Saturday in late May, when 40 people had walked through a door that had been closed for 8 years and had remembered together what a place can be when someone decides it is worth keeping. The lane lights stayed on below. Clara sat beside her with her cane across her knees and her hand near the photograph, and her eyes on the street that had been her town for 60 years. And they sat together while the dark came all the way down, and the stars appeared above the ridge to the east, and the building beneath them held its light against the night, the way it had always held the things that mattered quietly and for as long as it took for the right person to come back for them.